Well, since I retired from Shell, I decided that I still want to continue in the energy marketplace, but in a very different way. I'm convinced that unless and until this country gets a grand plan on energy, we're going to continue to stumble around the way we have been stumbling around literally for decades. So I started an organization called Citizens for Affordable Energy. Its purpose is to educate Americans on what they need to know in a nonpartisan, non-political way, what they need to know about energy and the environment. I think we suffer in this country from disinformation, misinformation, and lack of information. I'd like to fill that vacuum, fill it with good information, because public policy is really the core opportunity we have to solve our energy future. Without sound public policy, if we just move from right to left or from one zig to another zag, if we simply let special interests determine the future of the country, we're all going to lose. So this is a grassroots effort to educate people where they live. It's a not-for-profit, it's not a lobbying firm, it's an education organization. If we look at all the energy that's used today in this country, from transportation fuels to electricity, 93% of our energy comes from hydrocarbons, meaning coal, gas, or oil, or nuclear. About 5% of our energy comes from hydropower. About 2% of our energy comes from renewable sources. That is a dramatic fact that very few people understand. When we talk about growing a green economy, we're starting from a very small base. We're starting from a 2 or 7% base if you count hydropower as renewable. So we're starting from a very low base. We have to be concerned about what level of investment we continue to put into the 93%, because what we don't want to do is, in the course of moving towards a renewable future, we don't want to run out of electricity. We don't want to run out of liquid fuels for our vehicles. We don't have mass transit in this country to make up for not having a vehicle. And we don't have battery-powered cars, not anytime soon. It's years and years away, but before the average consumer has a battery-powered car. Imagine what would happen in this country and the political reaction if suddenly we did not have enough electricity or did not have enough gasoline or diesel fuel to meet our daily needs. My worry is that because there's so much focus on the 2%, that we're not putting enough focus on the 93%, and we can't just turn off the 93% and continue to have the world's largest economy, or to continue to have the lifestyles that we're accustomed to. So we have a big job ahead of us. Yeah, we can only push a rope so far. And moving in the direction of renewable energy is, in a sense, pushing a rope, because there are so many unknowns and uncertainties. With wind, for example, the wind doesn't blow all the time. With solar, the sun doesn't shine at night. And in many parts of the country, it doesn't shine for much of the winter. There's a lot of cloud cover. So in terms of transitioning to a renewable fuel standard, which I think is what the administration is talking about, of some 20% or even 25% at some future point, we simply have to pace ourselves with realistic goals and objectives, not political goals and objectives. Here's where the nation could really founder on rocks, and that is, if political goals determine our energy future, we will fail. What we need are pragmatic, realistic goals rather than political goals to achieve what can reasonably and logically be achieved. I think we can be aggressive. I think we can be future focused. But if we're driven by political goals, here's the more fundamental problem. How long is a politician in office? 2 years or 4 years, and then they're up for re-election. A political goal is something that someone wants to accomplish in the eyes of the voters in a 2-year or 4-year cycle in order to be elected or to be re-elected. You can't do energy in 2- and 4-year cycles. Energy investments take sometimes decades from the beginning of the idea to the building of the project and its commissioning to the life cycle of that project. 30, 40 years for a power plant. 30, 40 years for a deep sea offshore oil field. 30, 40, 50 years for pipelines. So if we're only doing what is politically correct or politically driven, we will fail, because the energy time requirements are so different than the political time requirements. I think there's a lot of knowledge and experience in the corporate sector when it comes to energy. After all, for the last 100 years, we've had companies that have moved this nation to #1 in economic growth, #1 in lifestyle in the world. And don't forget, we fought world wars with American energy, American oil. And at the same time, we grew our economy to the largest and strongest in the world. We have to look ahead to see how do we have an abundant supply of energy. And the corporate side can tell you that because they know where the resources are, they know what the technology is. And I'm talking all corporate resources, the renewable energy companies as well as the traditional fossil companies and the nuclear companies. People know on the corporate side what's possible. The political side, I think, has let the country down because we've been zigzagging our policies back and forth since Richard Nixon was president. We've had 8 presidents that have promoted energy independence, and we're less independent today than we were when Richard Nixon started. In other words, we depend on more imports for crude oil today than we did in 1973 when we started the journey towards energy independence. Because the political class is back and forth, driven by their political time ambitions, we don't have a coherent, short, medium, long-term plan for the nation. But the biggest challenge I think we face in the future is from the third area. That's the consumer area. If we don't have well-informed consumers, who are well-informed citizens, who are well-informed voters, we will continue to be ripped back and forth by the political decisions of the 2- and 4-year cycle. So we have to educate consumers, citizens, voters, as to what are the risks and opportunities when it comes to energy. And it's only with an informed and an active consumer class that we will actually, in the future, solve our energy issues. We can point fingers of blame at corporations. We can point fingers of blame at politicians. But we are, at the end, a democracy. And it's the voice of the people that matters. And so if that voice of the people is not informed, educated, and understanding of what the risks and opportunities are, we get what we get. And unfortunately, that hasn't been good enough. So an educated consumer is really, I think, the primary objective of what we should all be concerned about: corporations, government, and of course, consumers themselves.
Then my last question has to do with foreign policy, since that's sort of the context with which we view a lot of these issues. Some people are already saying, what impact will the greening of the U.S. economy or moving more towards alternative energies, how will that impact our relationship with, say, world developing countries? What are some of the challenges that you foresee, say, over the next 10 years as our economy sort of shifts that are related to foreign policy and U.S. energy policy?
I think if we look ahead to what are the foreign policy implications of decarbonizing the U.S. energy system, most of the oil-producing nations are aware of that. Informed, intelligent leaders in places like Saudi Arabia, in places like Brazil, they're aware of the decarbonizing efforts underway, whether it's the US or Europe or other places. They're not very worried. They're not very worried because they know that for the next 10, 20, 30, or even 40 years, while these decarbonizing efforts are underway, their crude oil will continue to be in demand. They also know that the easy oil has been found and produced. So what they have available to sell will be needed by global markets, including the United States, for decades to come. They're not particularly worried, but the intelligent ones are already planning for the post-oil future. So I don't see a lot of political or a lot of foreign policy issues as a result of a decarbonizing effort, because these are mature, thoughtful states that are going to take advantage of their sovereign wealth while they can, meaning crude oil, but they're also going to transition their economies. What I'm less certain about are some of the petroleum dictators that exist around the world who tend to operate with a different paradigm. Not a paradigm of thoughtful global participation in whatever the energy markets are, but of successful near-term exploitation. The consequences on countries like Venezuela or other countries that are really run for short-term dictatorial purposes I don't know what the foreign policy implications are, but I think we need to be concerned about them.